I just ask you all to double check your cell phones and make sure they're off. There are 4 fire escapes. Doing my air stewardess bit, one there to the back. If you're asked to leave, please do so promptly. I'm being told that this will be on, it's being filmed, will be on YouTube. So I believe that email addresses were taken as you came through the door, so you'll be given the link. And lastly, we're going to try and wrap up for 2 o'clock. So if anybody's on a parking clock, don't get too worried. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tony Robotham. I'm the Managing Director of Montague Evans. We're a specialised real estate practice based in Guernsey. We've also got offices in London throughout the United Kingdom. For my sins, I'm also the current President of the Chamber of Commerce. But neither Montague Evans nor Chamber can take any credit for today's event, which has been laid on and sponsored by the Strategic Development Partnership, the Guernsey Property Forum and the Construction Industry Forum. The format for today is that I've been asked by the sponsors to present some slides, really as a scene setter, and introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Christine Whitehead from the Cambridge Centre for Housing and Planning Research. Professor Whitehead, though I'm going to slip very quickly into Christine, is also based at the London School of Economics, and she specialises in housing finance, housing policies, the issues of housing supply, development and affordable housing. When I wrote this, I said that she'd got considerable experience of the Channel Islands, so she corrected me and said, not Guernsey, but she has in recent years been advising our somewhat junior island, Jersey, on how they should restructure their state's housing programme. Christine's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, which I'm hoping will be both active and informative, with questions directed to our panel. Alongside Christine on the panel, we have Claire Smith. Claire's a lawyer specialising in planning covenants, currently working just down the road at Oceans. Paul Luxon probably needs no introduction, a local businessman and our deputy in charge of Health and Social Services Department. I'll act as the moderator. It's not what I'm trained to do, but I'll do my best, and I might duck in and out on some of the Q&A if some answers are needed. It seems to me, and this is a very personal view, that the state and health of our housing sector, across all of its spectrums, is of real and quite vital importance to the island. I'm hoping that you'll all agree with me on that statement. After all, there's over 200 of you in the room. Charles tells me that he was originally hoping for somewhere between 50 and 75, and the numbers have just grown. So during today, I would ask you to think about why a vibrant and appropriate housing sector is important to us all. My brief thoughts on this are as follows. The availability of housing, doesn't matter whether it's owner-occupied or rented, affects the cost of living, wages paid to and needed by our population, and so impacts on the competitiveness of our industries. It also impacts on people's perceptions, their savings, what they work for and what they aspire to. And it influences on how this island is viewed as a place to come and work in, indeed how it's viewed internally as a place to work, and impacts on the decisions that we'll all make on whether or not to stay here in retirement. So I believe that as an island we need to ensure that the housing market operates effectively at all levels, understanding that a change in the dynamics of one sector will influence and impact on all the other sectors. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the slides. So you bear with me. You all know technology is not my thing. What we're going to try and do here is just spend a couple of minutes and just lay out some of the current economic position and the housing position. The local market housing prices. Broadly, if you look at that, we avoided the price crash in the UK post-Lehman's. But it seems to be catching up with us. Roughly 10% drop last year. But there's really been no capital growth, at least in real terms, since 2008. Earnings and employment figures. Again, in real terms, earnings have been static for the last 5 or 6 years, but we've seen a decline, and that's on the right, in the number of people employed by over 1,000, which is considerable for an island of our size. Population and net migration. I'm sure you've all seen the headlines over the last couple of years. 2013, 2014 saw a drop in our population. 2015, right down at the bottom, figure of 38, a slight increase but only minor. The question there for debate is, what is the long-term population projection? Because that's going to have a significant impact on housing issues. Aging demographic profile. I reckon most of you have heard speeches on this. Various organisations, including the states, are trying to make us all aware of this. Look at the bottom. 1981, peak age group between 10 and 19. 35 years later, which is now, peak age group is between 40 and 49. That puts me well outside it. 35 years' time, where will we be? That'll be 2050. What will the peak age group be then? And once we can work that out, we need to think about the type of housing that's going to be needed for the population. Local market sales transactions. Well, the graph tells you the picture. The trend since 2011 is downwards. We're seeing today roughly 40% less transactions than 5 years ago. And I suppose the question is, for the audience, is what's happening now the new norm, or is it ever going to change? This mirrors that. Mortgages, broadly, secured loans, mortgages. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that if the number of sales have fallen, so will the number of loans, both by number and value. Help to buy. FTBs, first-time buyers. It took me a few minutes with Google to work that out last night. Christine will be talking to this, but the point here is that some form of help exists both in Jersey and the UK, and we haven't adopted anything. House price correction. Scary. This is a projection by the Guernsey Property Forum. You can see 2015 going back, we saw a drop. There's an estimate there from them, another 10% for this year. So put the two together and let's call it 20%. 2017, frankly, who knows? But I suppose there is a question there, is you've seen those sorts of figures, those decreases in capital value, happening both in the United Kingdom and Jersey. So perhaps for us it's just happening now, it's happening at a different time, but maybe it doesn't put us out of step with the broader worldwide economies. Guernsey's public sector housing offering. I'm not going to ask you to read all of that, but I'll just draw your attention to the two figures down in the bottom right-hand corner. These are the figures from the States. Roughly 250 people on the demand list for partial ownership, and 183 net for rental. I don't know whether there's an overlap there. Gut feel is maybe there will be, but I don't know. Bring everyone up to date on some of the things that have happened recently. left-hand column, compulsory land transfers between 20 and 30%. That went into the draft island-wide plan. And has been debated more recently up at the States, with the view that possibly it needed a little bit more research behind it, and somewhat more intellectual view taken on how those figures would be arrived at and the justification for it. Lastly, States of Guernsey housing stock. Some 1,600 units available for rental, administered by States Housing. Notionally, I guess, there's a rent of 18 million a year, but of course that's gross. A lot of that doesn't take into account that you see there 96% of tenants receive help to pay their rent. And I think very interestingly, on line 4, tenants are not asked to contribute more than 25% of their income. No idea why, but that's a subject for some debate. So I said I'd do 10 minutes, I've done 11. That's me done for the moment, so I'd just like to welcome Professor Whitehead to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk in Guernsey about housing issues. What I want to start by saying very clearly is that although I have been involved in housing research for longer than most of you have been alive, I have not directly been, and this is the first time I've ever been to Guernsey. I nearly got here when I was 12, but the weather was too bad. And I was very, very seasick. But unhappily, this has been no opportunities in between. My background is an academic, but I've researched on a very wide range of things. But back in the 1970s, I was lucky enough, foolish enough perhaps, to go into government for 2 years, part-time, to support a new housing policy regime. I was foolish enough to say, I wanted to stay for 2 years because it would take the first year to organise it and the second year to put it into place. Well, that doesn't happen. These things take a very, very long time. And I learned an awful lot about the interface between politics and advising. And these are two very, very distinct things. My role has always been to advise other people's roles to make political decisions, which take advice into consideration, but are not determined by it. So I've continued to be involved with a lot of different governments, including your neighbour. So the starting point, I think, Tony's really already covered. And the reason why I think housing is very much at the forefront of decisions at the present time is because the economic environment has changed. You had what might from outside be seen as a very comfortable world in which you more than balanced your budgets and you were able to do the sorts of things that you wanted to do without putting too much pressure on the population. And since there's no financial crisis, to some extent, that general feeling of comfort has perhaps reduced. Population hasn't grown as was projected. Average earnings haven't increased in real terms since 2008. And average house prices are now, in real terms, very similar to what they were in 2008. But there's also within house prices been quite a lot of volatility. So people are uncertain about what is happening and where they're going. But what is worth going to give you 1/14 of the value of the house. That is a value which is similar to central London. Now, there are other similarities in the proportion of finance, etc. But it's not, I think, something which is obvious that Guernsey should have a house price ratio which is quite that excessive, and which means that very large number of people can't pay for that housing. And I think it's very unsustainable. And I think that this is one of the issues that people are uncertain about the prices into the future, and therefore uncertain about what they should be doing. The way that most countries in the British Isles, which there are 9, 10, look at the question of housing demand and supply and need into the future, has been normally to start from a projection of housing requirements. Now this is very much a plan of term. How many houses do we need to make provision for? And we start from demographics, always in that. So the basis is what are the projections of households and what proportion of people of different ages will head a household and will want a separate home or will be able to afford a separate home. So we start from household projections which are based on age and household characteristics, plus the evidence on the existing stock. Have you got a lot of vacant units? Have you got units which need to be demolished, etc.? And from that you work out the proportion and the numbers of houses which would accommodate people in the future in the same way as they have been accommodated in the past. So it isn't a forecast, it's a projection. It takes the past experience and moves it forward. And you use it, in the main, for two things. One is land allocation, to ensure that there is enough land to make these houses actually happen within the land system. And secondly, to clarify what proportion of households are likely to need some help with their housing costs, and therefore what the impact is on the government's budget of providing the levels of housing which were implied. So it's not a demand for. It isn't saying that people can afford the amount of houses which you estimate are necessary. What you're saying is that given the state has got an idea of what they want people to live like, that all families should have a separate home, that all couples should have a separate home, that all individuals who wish to live alone should be able to live alone. These are all political decisions, if people can't afford it. But the housing requirements are based on what's happened in the past and into the future. And it then gets turned into, in some contexts, but not all contexts, a target. And it's clear that you had a target for some years of 300 units per annum. That target did not reflect demand or supply. It didn't reflect either the wish of people to pay for it or the capacity of the industry to provide it. What it did was say, if you want the future to look like the past, this is how many units you need to provide. Now, as life gets a little bit harder, we tend to be more interested in the economics, the demand and supply, how much subsidy will need to go in there if people are to be housed in that way. So it's always important to realise that projections and targets are basically extending the past and what was the government prepared to do. Demand, of course, depends on income, and when we've had, as we have across the British Isles, uncertainties about income and incomes falling after 2008 and only now getting back to where they were in 2008, then of course demand for housing goes down. So if we look at these projections in England, partly because that's the best, there's more information about it, the latest projections, which I was involved in, are lower than historically. And they're usually gone up each time that we made a projection because incomes grow, people like to live separately. We don't much like living with one another. So we add, as incomes grow, we have more households. But this one is lower than earlier estimate. And it's lower because of the impact of, first of all, an affordability crisis after 2000, when house prices went out of line with incomes. And secondly, the financial crisis. Two very distinct things happening. And what happened as a result of this was that the numbers of households that formed between 2000 and 2011, 2001 and 2011 was much less than we had projected earlier in 2000. Young people were sharing with their parents, they were sharing with each other. The private rented sector doubled in size between 2000 and 2014, and many more people live. The occupancy rate in the private rented sector is higher than elsewhere. And owner occupation declined in England from 69–70% to about 64%. So we've had big tenure changes, we've had big lifestyle changes in how people exist. Now, the projections take those into account because they happened in the past. What we don't know is, as we look forward into the future, if incomes are going to grow, if we're going to go back to a reasonably healthy environment in which incomes go up by 2% per annum, then we would expect to move back to more households forming, more owner occupation, possibly a reduction in private renting, and certainly more younger people setting up on their own. But the projections don't take that. And for that reason, if you're going to use projections for land allocation, for deciding how much government ought to put into affordable housing and other decisions of that sort, then it's really, really important to build flexibility into the system. Our local authorities in England have to provide, by 2017, a local plan. And that local plan has to enable the land to be made there to build for the homes which are expected to be required. Given these uncertainties, all the Baker really is to define the land for the next 20 years, well, 2031, in general terms, and make quite sure that they've got a flow of land coming through. And if it starts to run out, then they are required to put more in. So you've got to have that more flexible approach, using the evidence and making decisions on a very regular basis. Now, if we look at the Guernsey projections, the Guernsey system is very, very similar in terms of in principle, and you have some very good data. You have some very good data on population, not quite so sort of clear on households. But most of your past projections, at least your latest past projection, is clearly too high. It's too high in those commas in the sense that it's based on an expanding economy, and the last 5 years have not been that, and that has impacted on what has been turned out to be possible in terms of house building and application. I think one of the big issues around is the uncertainties around the migration figures, because migration has been a bit volatile, but it's been net out migration sometimes instead of net in migration, which has historically been the case. But there's certainties around the aging, and you clearly pointed out that you're getting older on average, and you've got a significant aging population issue around not just support for older people, but also the housing which they're going to want to live in. And I don't think a lot is known about the behaviour of young people, the housing behaviour of young people. I'm sure you know an awful lot about the normal behaviour. But the housing behaviour of young people, across Europe, there is evidence that young people are behaving somewhat differently. And part of that is about uncertainties of jobs. It's about not wanting to settle down quite as early. You know, the stories of the average 30-year-old is still a teenager across Europe, the story. So how younger people behave, when they will form their households, whether they will want to stay can afford to pay for their own home, except for the fact that your house prices are quite so high. So how do you use projections when they're made? You have to use them sensibly and flexibly. I think the big issue for people coming from outside is that Guernsey is a state with a significant civil service, with a significant support structure, planning departments, etc., etc. But you're the size of a small local authority in Britain. So I usually look for a local authority of a similar size, and we're talking a local authority which would normally in Britain be part of a broader unit, broader authority. So 64,000 is, you're asking a lot of people to make these types of planning decisions, and as well as all the other things that as a state you have got to do. So it's important to get simplicity, and it's important to get very great clarity about what you're trying to do. And in particular, there tends to be a muddle in all of the planning literature between whether what your objective is to ensure land availability and infrastructure is in place so that the housing can be built, or whether your objective is significantly about getting what we call standing gain. That is to say that when the land is allocated, the land price goes up, and there's the possibility of getting, of extracting some of that for planning covenants of one form or another. And importantly in this context of how much of a planning gain should be in the role provision of being used for affordable housing rather than for infrastructure, is that the levels of housing need identified in your slide are really very low. Say, 100 or so people on a waiting list. So either your social housing isn't very attractive, or given that the rents are significantly below the average, you would expect there to be a significant waiting list. Or there are other reasons. And equally, the surveys, which are taken fairly regularly, show that there are much higher levels of housing needs. But the sort of housing need that there is about affordability. It is not significantly about quality or numbers of houses. So it's an affordability story more than a numbers of units story. So coming back to the planning objectives, what planning is about is getting numbers of units and affordability. But a significant part of it is about understanding who can't afford the housing, why they can't afford the housing, what can be done to help that process. And it may not be about providing physical units, it may be about supporting incomes, or it may be about supporting into a different tenure. And one of the points, therefore, to bring out is that your income distribution isn't that bad. If your lower quartile household can afford and wants a different type of housing and social housing, then maybe it's better to support shallow subsidy housing, mostly in the context of urban occupation, than it is to support more additional social housing. Maybe not, but it needs to be looked at. And that is the case in the Scottish environment, where a large proportion of what is newly built is basically what we call intermediate tenure. It is shared ownership or partial ownership of one form or another, or it's intermediate rents, which are higher than the rents which are for the poorest in the social housing context, but below market. Now I want to talk mainly about three distinct things, and I'm not taking too long. One is about the whole issue of planning for affordable housing. The second is about support for urban occupation and the financing market. And the third is around what your social housing system might look like. Because I was asked to go as broadly as possible, and that's the three main areas. And let me be clear, I am not saying you allocation towards affordable housing had to be done, well, and towards other types of infrastructure, had to be done on the basis that developer put in a planning decision, put planning option, and the local authority decided what was suitable on the basis of the planning criteria, and then contracted to provide for permanent social housing or other factors which were necessary on a contractual basis separate from a planning decision. Now, it took a while to settle down. It took really 10 years to settle down to a point where we were getting large proportions of our affordable housing from the planning system. Basically, planning decision is made, value of the land goes up, you can implicitly tax that increase in land value to provide for social infrastructure of one form or another, notably affordable housing. And after 2000, around 60% of affordable housing was built on Section 106 land. So it was a very significant way of getting land into the system. But in the period from 2000 to 2008, it was in some ways a relatively easy process. Land values were going up, house prices were going up, you had a larger site, you were building it down slowly, the later ones were getting a higher value than the earlier ones. The developer did quite well, the local authority did quite well, and nobody complained very hard. Well, it did, but nobody complained. But after 2008, there were significant problems. The problems were twofold. One, the decisions had been already made, because many large sites take 10 years to build out. And in others, simply what was going to be the future was uncertain. So after this, the government had to build in an adjustment downwards as well as an adjustment upwards. And so the developer could come and say, the system, the planning permission is no longer viable, and it's a requirement of Section 106 that there is violation, and therefore you must make some adjustments so we can afford to build this. And most of that adjustment has been in the context of affordable housing, because the infrastructure is seen as necessary in order to keep things going. And there's been considerable gaming in high demand areas of developers paying a bit too much for the land given what the expectation was about density, etc. And then saying it doesn't fit and therefore I can't afford the affordable housing unless you're having a bit more density. So breaking the rule of the planning decision should not be associated with it. But overall, in the English context, Section 106, I'm not going to talk about SIL, has worked reasonably well, and it is still bringing in a significant amount of money and a significant amount of affordable housing. But to introduce a system of planning covenant, which is what is being suggested in Guernsey, on larger size, had a period of uncertainty, and a period when the expectations are lower than they were, maybe when the options were taken out of the hand, etc. It's going to be a much more problematic issue. It requires a great deal of negotiation capacity, a lot of resource to do it, and we probably don't have enough information on land values and the extent of what I'm calling planning gateway uplift, which comes from the development, to ensure viability. And of course, there's always a political decision as to whether it will change, as it has done in Guernsey. So, the second aspect of provision in this context is whether government should be assisting. You had this part in the middle where nothing was being done in Guernsey to support or bring extra people into home ownership. Not entirely clear that's true, but you do or 50%, move up as they've got higher income and or a lump sum from somebody or whatever, and buy out the whole property, which gives them a great deal more freedom. And there are risks attached to it. And in the Guernsey context, I understand, well, you can't go above 80%, so you're always in this sort of partial ownership situation. The other initiatives to support home ownership in England that have been important, the most important has been the right to buy, which was introduced in 1980 by Mr. Thatcher, by which you could buy your own home or your own social home at a discount and become an owner-occupant. Now this made sense in a world in which, before that, people had not been able to get mortgages at all. So lots of people who could actually afford their own home were actually not able to get in because of the credit constraints. But of course they also got in this context a very large discount, and that helped enormously. Some 2 million households have benefited from a right to buy and become owner-occupiers, and that's what jumped our owner-occupation rate from 60% to 70%. And now many of those are actually going into the private renting sector. Over the last few years, i.e. post the financial crisis, the major policies which have aimed to help stop the decline in owner occupation and nothing else, help to buy, which is a partial ownership scheme, which is based on a mortgage as opposed to separation of ownership and shared ownership. On help to buy, basically, you can get equity mortgage on 20% of the value, which you pay no interest on for the first 5 years. So you have to put down a 5% deposit, that's all. You get an equity loan from the government, and you pay the rest. You can only use it on new build, so it helps there are these very detailed credit assessment requirements, which include, importantly, stress testing for the possibility of an interest rate will go up a significant amount. And that means that a large number of people who, on reasonable grounds, could be expected to be able to pay for their home over their lifetime, but might have some monthly periods, are not getting it. But within that, we are now getting back to a 95% mortgage for first-time buyers, so the deposit issue has become a much less important one. Interest-only mortgages have disappeared except for buy-to-let, where your cover is for rent, not for personal income. But the bank is really worried about buy-to-let, something which interests you, we can come back to it. But mostly they're interested in the fact that it may be crowded out first-time buyers in urban areas. And there's also an increasing emphasis on shared and partial ownership schemes to enable people to have own occupation with a small subsidy attached, but hopefully into the longer term be able to pay it. The really big impact of the financial crisis, though, was not on the mortgage market, where there was very little default, but was on developers because they didn't default left, right, and centre, and the banks can still talk of all sorts of development assets which are not worth very much. So developers have a much less access to debt finance, and it may be that that is also an issue in Guernsey, because the developers who depend, if they depend upon debt rather than equity, will be finding it very difficult to get. Social housing. I think I should really be finishing, so I will talk very quickly about this. It was what I went to Jersey to talk about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It took a very long time. But basically about whether the social housing sector was efficiently operated and whether there were better ways, and whether the state could do better at it. And historically, the state in New Jersey has been, shall we say, not consistent in exactly how rents were set or how much money the state is expected to pay. So there's lots of different ways you can organise social housing. The old tradition has always been a Department of State who builds it, owns it, lets it out, usually at something which is a proportion of somebody's income, which is a sort of modified version of what's happening. But there are lots of ways. We can use local authorities, straightforward, state. We can use ALMA, we have an ALMA, a state-owned arm's length organisation, which technically has management freedom. Housing associations, which are charitable organisations whose role in life is to provide housing for particular groups. And you usually get some form of subsidy from the state in the context of Guernsey. Subsidy so far was being mostly in the form of land. And your ALMA gets that. I don't know whether there are any associations that do, I think not. Or indeed private providers who can be registered. The housing association, but they can also be a private developer or a private owner who is prepared to provide social housing within a license and within a framework. And that's the way that it's done in Germany. And then there's the question of who builds it. It can be built by the authority itself, or it can be built in joint ventures between the authority and developers or housing associations. It can be directly commissioned from the developer, or it can simply be purchased on that market. So there are lots and lots of different possibilities. My role in Jersey was to examine these alternative approaches, see which were viable and which might generate a sustainable system where the housing was being adequately repaired and improved, and where the tenants could afford to rent the welfare system as well as the rental system. But it was also, if we're honest about it, it was simply a way of trying to get housing a little bit away from the politicians. Because the politicians always wanted exceptions to any rule. In the end, government went, the state government went for what you'd expect. They went for what they're used to, which is a state-owned as much housing provision for special needs as actually are going to be used. And then in addition to that, you've got an AMBO, which runs two parts, a rented part, a social rented part, and a shared ownership or part, and which gets assistance from government often in the form of land. And you've got this single model of part. And of course, the first question that anybody outside would ask is, do you need two ways of doing it? Do you need only one way, or do you need a multiplicity? And that's not a straightforward answer. But I would say that the current system, from a distance, without real knowledge, would appear to be quite likely to be inefficient, because it is trying to do different things in different ways. We've got a range of options, which we've already talked about. But I think the social provision level is probably too low, and the need for specialist housing is probably significant. But I would say that both your tradition and your experience and your income distribution would suggest that you probably could cope with a higher owner-occupation rate, and that would give you greater overall satisfaction and possibly lower costs. In terms of how you would reorganise the social sector, I don't think that you're in a starting position which would allow, the extreme that the government wants to sell it off so it gets a large amount of money is not going to work just like that. And I don't know whether there is a potential appetite for a range of different types of providers, small associations, etc. But whatever, any change would require a considerable amount of thought in one way or another. So, concluding quickly, you've got a fair amount of really good data. You've got some gaps, areas where I think you need more distribution of income affordability, but I should also have added in that context private renting. Private renting is more than a quarter of your overall stock, and there isn't a great deal of information about that. The fundamentals of the house prices look high in relationship to the economy and the income distribution. So owner-occupation in some sense isn't as attractive as that, because 2070 might really be a problem, or 2073 2021 might be a problem. And it's also not clear, although it's in the rhetoric, for an outsider, that people actually have the capacity, financial capacity, to move out of social housing without some form of government support, or equally to move out of shared apartment ownership into full ownership of dwelling. So if that is seen to be an important part of the system, you need to produce mechanisms that can allow that to happen. Nor is it clear to me how much of this is about credit constraints opposed to natural demand, because of the uncertainty. And I think it's probably more of that than the former. Instead of that private renting. You're quite restricted in the range of policies which you do offer to people in terms of subsidies, land allocation subsidies, it's land subsidies, potentially planning subsidies for land allocation, and shared lower rent, but not many other possible approaches. And I think in this context it would be surprising if you managed to hit the sort of implicit targets in terms of housing output. And also more generally, you should have targets as such, if they are very closely related to demand and potential supply. In that context, the question is whether the land could be made more easily available if there are plenty of land around. And I know you have a fairly brownfield approach, and that you wish to keep agricultural land as agricultural. But I do wonder whether land is inherently in short supply, or again whether there's a political position. If you are going to go down the planning company's way, given where you're starting from, you're going to have it would suggest the experience that I have and others have would suggest it's going to have to be a quite flexible system, and it could be quite a costly system as well. So the question, fundamental question is, will the market support additional new build at the moment? Probably a bit, but they're probably not as much as people would like, and for that reason, there is looking at a range of policies to support intermediate tenures, i.e. very less shallow subsidies to help people into an occupation or into shared ownership. We need to be very much clearer, I think, about the role that social housing is meant to play, and that will help to decide what size it ought to be. If it's really only going to be for the very, very vulnerable, then it needs to be more obvious that it's providing additional support, but it also needs to be funded in a different way. If it's to be broader based than that, then we need to know the definition of broader based. And I think there needs to be more general discussion about efficiency of governance. And fundamentally, of course, as always, as every academic, every economist always says, you need more information and you need more analysis. But please keep it simple. Thank you very much.
Christine, thank you for that. I was making a few notes as Christine was talking, and I took a few ideas out to just throw into the room before we start the Q&A. Christine's absolutely right. More research into projections, speed of review of policy, vitally important. We all say in this small island that we should be fleet of foot, so it's about time we started proving that. We need to better understand financial viability on development sites, with greater research, review of shared ownership, a better understanding of the needs of both the old and young coming through. That was a point that I particularly took from the PwC presentations here a month ago. We probably need a discussion on right to buy and help to buy. The mortgage market, can we influence it? And if we can, should we? I think that's a big question. And then social housing, states, quasi-states, JVs, massive influence of politics and politicians into that issue. And should there be competition in that sector? And planning covenants, well, if they come in, they need to be flexible. And that all comes back to the speed of thinking, the speed of review. So then my thoughts, we'll have a Q&A now. I'm hoping none of you are going to take offence on this. I'd like to limit questions to 30 seconds. If a question goes beyond 30 seconds, it's not a question, it's a speech. And I'm also going to ask our panel to keep their answers reasonably brief, because I'm desperately hoping that there's going to be lots of you in the audience who want to ask questions. If you don't ask questions, I'm going to stand here feeling like a complete idiot, and I'd rather we avoided that. So, anyone got a question that we'd like to put to the panel? Andrew. Take the microphone so we can all hear. Thank you.
Hi, Andy Merrick from London. Could you give us an indication of what's the best way to establish a true picture of the housing need and as a way of setting the house building targets, or in actually if we do need house building targets, I suppose?
Christine.
Very good question, very long answer, if not careful. I'm trying to... It isn't, as I'm trying to say, you're only useful to have a target if you can think of a way in which it might be achieved. And if the target is based on simple numbers without any thought about how much people are prepared to pay and how much the government is prepared to pay, then the target will not be achieved. Yeah, it could be the economy takes off and you allow lots of land out, then you'll get more. If not, not. So I would argue that you need to unpack what a target is and say what are the causes of you not getting what the projections are about, which is saying if you want to keep to the standards you've got now, then you will need 300 more units per annum, whatever.
land plan group, so just for clarity. Deputy Heidi Salisbury, who's with us today, on the 26th of January, laid an amendment which directed the states to ask the Housing Department and the TNR to go away to hold the current 2007 resolution in place until a proper and appropriate review be made of the planning confidence in the current market. I won't read the rest of it. We have had, Andrew, we have had housing needs targets. The thing is, they haven't meant anything because we haven't absolutely had strategies to be able to deliver them. Lots of good intent. Frankly, the targets we've been operating with over the last half dozen, 10 years have been irrelevant. And I think Deputy Salisbury's amendment absolutely helps the housing department, especially, who get lumbered with this issue. It's a complex one. To actually spend some money, taxpayer money, to do a proper review, to do exactly what Christine said.
Thank you. So what you're saying, Christine, to clarify, is that we just need to be more intelligent about how we look at it and bring into the issue people's incomes and their ability to pay.
And the state apparently provide subsidy if the big one going to pay for it.
Fair enough. Another question, please.
Jeremy Greer, Construction Industry Forum. My question's about covenants, which you've touched on a couple of times. Our interest in the forum is in having a healthy housing market and a vibrant development sector, and alongside that a busy construction industry. And we haven't got any of those things at the moment. The idea of covenants is being pushed forward by the Housing Department and the Environment Department. And my question is, what advice would you give to those departments to ensure that at the end of the planning consideration we end up with a workable solution to the question of planning covenants?
Christine?
I think
You can argue about that.
we can all argue about it, I'm sure. I think with what you just said, maybe suddenly to think, well, not suddenly, but to think, if you're not careful, you take the problem of the target being irrelevant to a planning covenant being irrelevant because you haven't sorted out the underlying economics and financial capacities. So the first thing I want to know is when you get planning permission or whatever the formal terminology is there a significant increase in value? In other words, is the value in housing bigger than the value in other uses? If it is, then there is the potential for some form of covenant to sub-market provision. But we started in 1990. That was at the depths of a recession. We started very, very slowly. From 94 to 2007, the economy and the housing market was constantly improving. And I think it's really very difficult to put something which is going to be so open-ended negotiated without really good knowledge about what the land values are in place without it upsetting the system for a significant amount of time and also costing a lot to run. So, simple-mindedly, anything which you build ought to cover the costs of immediate infrastructure which are required. That's the starting point. Maybe it's already done. Secondly, there is a case for all development, not just residential, paying some form of tax, inverted commas, to enable the infrastructure of all sorts, including affordable housing, to be put in place. And I would suspect that you might be better off doing it the reverse way to what England has done, which is to put in sill first and include within that the affordable housing, so a tariff, but a lowish tariff, see how it goes. That's based on a range of experience, but not detailed knowledge of this particular environment.
Yeah. I mean, what I've seen in the UK, the way it works is you need to be flexible. You need to be able to move quickly. Because land values change dramatically. They don't change over a decade or two. They can often change over a year or two. So what was viable one year may be completely unviable the next year. So you need a mechanism, I sense, to be able to accommodate that.
Yeah, two quick things, a direct answer unintended consequences. We saw unintended consequences in 2010-11, I think it was, with the population management review. What that did immediately, it undermined the open market. And we've had 5 years where the open market, I'd like to say, has been frozen. But it's contracted, number of transactions lower, capital values low. That was an unintended consequence of some clumsy wording in what was a very important piece of work, which was the housing law, 1997 housing laws on fit for purpose. This work needed to be done. We needed a new population management regime, which was good. But by embroiling the open market in that review, meant for 5 years we completely and utterly undermined it. Unintended consequences. I'm worried about the covenant that's in the IDP proposals. I understand what housing is trying to achieve, but I worry about the unintended consequence in our economy at the moment is too fragile to risk doing something that might be right, but might actually have unintended consequences. The second thing is development and construction is good for Guernsey, it's good for the state of Guernsey, it's good for the TNR, the taxpayer recipients of monies, because the more that on-island economic multiplier that happens through construction and development, then the less taxes need to be taken from us all to fund the public services. Unintended consequences in development, proportionate and empathetic, is good for Guernsey.
I agree. Another question, please.
Can I just add something to that from a legal perspective? The wording that's in place at the moment hasn't got enough detail to allow the flexibility that we need. So at the moment there is no legal definition in Guernsey of what constitutes viable or viability, whereas in England there is a whole lot of underlying information in place. And in a marketplace this small in terms of construction and competitors, you would effectively have to go entirely open book before you could prove to the states whether or not your scheme was viable. And the system here is just not set up for that. So planning covenants as they are currently worded, the industry isn't ready for it. It will cause things to go backwards, and it will make an awful lot of work for planning lawyers, of which I'm one. So I'm talking against my own self-interest, but in all honesty, as it currently exists and as it's proposed in the IDP at the moment, it won't work.
I think it's an interesting point there. I mean, certainly in the UK, there are some very sophisticated financial modelling programmes that are used by both local authorities and developers, and they broadly use the same programmes.
You have to have buy-in from both
But,
sides.
so you get buy-in from both sides to try and understand that viability. I mean, obviously, if you're using in effect different valuation techniques, you never agree
You can't
anything.
impose it.
But there are a number, and they've been proved to work, and everybody buys into it and they adopt it, and it produces a sensible solution, but it also allows for flexibility.
Could I just add in that context that it took a long while for that to happen, and it was a costly process.
Yes.
And the viability rules currently are being undermined by a number of different things. So I think that the other point to make is that we don't have an estimate of how much planning gain is taken this way. But the guesswork is that it's between 30 and 40%. So in other words, there should be, implicitly, to oil the wheels, there has to be enough there for everybody to get what they need. And if there isn't enough there to get what you need, it's going to be a fight for whether the developer gets enough profit and the local authority gets enough of the other side of it.
And I think that's particularly relevant over here, where a lot of our developers are fairly small. We don't have the sort of listed house builders that the UK has. And a lot of land is owned without debt. And so one of the issues we have here, is if a developer just says, I'm not going to develop, that they won't develop. Whereas if you look at Barrett's or Persimmon, they have targets every year that they've got to deliver for the stock market. So there's a different dynamic to the way that system works.
Yeah, well, that's private clients. You haven't had the benefit locally of the Help to Buy scheme. Would you be supportive of the state's assisted first-time buyers deposit scheme to assist first-time buyers getting on the market?
I want to know an awful lot more about the details before being sure. I was part of the team that evaluated Help to Buy, I think my starting point was that maybe this was not really much more than a fluffy way of looking as though you were doing something. But in fact, I think outside London and some parts of the South East, it's worked really quite well. It's meant more people have looked at new homes and learned that energy efficiency is now something which is real as opposed to our own homes which are not. It meant that a lot of people who have been stuck for 7 or 8 years because of the way the economy has been working were able actually to buy something with 2 bedrooms and so actually have a child who they've been waiting for, and or even 2 children. And so, in the main, I think Help to Buy has worked in what I'm going to call its pure form, that is to say, 80%, 5% deposits, and a zero value loan for 5 years. The government's not going to pay an awful lot for it as long as the economy picks up sort of mildly. And I think the direct relationship to new build has actually worked surprisingly well. So I'm much more positive about it than I expected, in principle.
I know I have a view on that, but Paul,
Yeah, we've got to do something different. Our Guernsey market, whether you call it development, construction, sales, transactions, it's flat, it's frozen, it's in hiatus, it's stuck, and it wouldn't appear that there is any absolute reason for it. There is capital now, there are investors, there is land, there are planning permissions, there is a need, but there's an uncertainty around that kind of economic reality in Guernsey, it would appear. And so we've got to do something different. What I suggest, Tony, Deputy Saint-Pierre couldn't be here today, but Deputy Roger Parrott, who sits on the T&R board, is here. And I know, because we set up a group working with conveyancing advocates, estate agents, and professional intermediaries, and looking at what we could do about the open market, how we could stimulate locate Guernsey, trying to look at all of these things. Deputy Parrott might just be able to add something in terms of how T&R. Deputy Saint-Pierre is here.
No, he's stuck in the back. I saw him come in as I started speaking.
Deputy Parrott is very relieved.
I just wondering whether he's done it with his sunglasses on and would like to speak.
In terms of capital concept and ideas and answers to be a question, Gavin might be able to add something.
Gavin, do you want to contribute to Ian's question, or do you rather run a mile?
I'm looking forward to Roger answering on my behalf, actually, in my supposed absence. No, I mean, clearly, you've articulated the issues, Paul, and I think it clearly is something that needs to be considered. And I think there are clear risks associated with doing so, but given the state of the market, it would be foolhardy not to take a serious look at it. And that's the work which we have been doing through Treasury and Resources and indeed the Constant Fund as well.
Thank you. I think that there's a thought there that's been alluded to initially by Christine and Paul and Gavin that Help to Buy certainly has a role. It's much easier to bring it in, I sense, if your economy and your housing market is either static or moving upwards. Possibly you've got to think about who bears the risk of the debt or the equity if your prices are sliding.
I mean, you certainly don't want if everybody convinced the price is going to slide, you ain't going to get it going, whatever. But it is a risk-sharing process in the sense that the state takes 20% of the equity risk, and that has its deal of safety involved. So, no, I mean, if take a really disastrous one, of course things can happen, but we say that house prices are really out of line with what we're paying. We're expecting the adjustment to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, then Help to Buy is not going to help. But if there are good reasons to believe that there are a large number of people, or some people, and there's 280 shared ownership people, who would be prepared to take some form of risk, because what you are getting out of is a home. And
actually. You mentioned mobility between types of housing. We've obviously discussed the mortgages and various other options. I'm just curious if there is any other particular examples of ways, for example, you mentioned 25% and the private rental market, to encourage these people to consider the housing and buying their own property and to be able to move between these types. Thank you.
I mean, clearly, it is a small island, so the reality is mobility is about getting a better home or getting something which more fits your requirements. It's not really about getting closer to the work, or not often. So mobility around the country, it seems to me that if you start from the fact that 96% or 94% of your social tenants need help to pay the rent, which can't be above 25% of their income, then you're not going to move anybody out of social renting into some other form without some significant subsidy. And it's a political decision taken by Thatcher, but in those days there were a lot of people in social housing who actually could afford to be in owner occupation, or at least could be, with a bit of a push, get there. So I think I think there's a real decision to be made about whether you think there are large numbers of people in social renting who, in the long term, will be better off having some stake in their home, in which case you're going to have to subsidise it. There isn't any other way of doing it. But I do think that things like Help to Buy or mortgage guarantees can help other people to get into owner occupation or into partial ownership. And I think partial ownership is an important part of a world in which uncertainty is the game.
Tony, can I just ask Christine? America and some continental European countries obviously prefer the rental model. The UK and Guernsey, clearly over the years, we've tended to prefer the model of owning our own homes. What's happened recently over the last 20 years is that we've had an awful lot of investors in buy-to-lets, and that's increasing. So all of that must have an impact on the issue of social housing that you've just described. So how do we actually sort of square off these issues in terms of making sure we do understand the needs and the build requirement for social housing and the different partial ownership? How do we square that up with the dynamics that are happening in terms of investors owning property to rent out to the private rental market?
Yes, I think this is a massively difficult issue. Anybody who's been following the papers in Britain who don't understand this issue at all.
That's why we have
the Bank of England have two bits of the Bank of England have got different views from each other, let alone from the Treasury, let alone from any reasonable economist. So let's not assume that there is a rational simple answer there. The starting point for buy-to-let is there are large numbers of people who, especially in London, but the growth of the private rental sector is right across the country, who can't get into an occupation or are not yet stable enough even to want to, or never will. But so if you're 25 and you expect to go back to do a master's degree and to change your job and so on, you don't want to settle down until your mid-30s. We were having people buying owner occupation into owner occupation in 25, 23, 22. And what we're seeing, rather uncomfortably, is a move towards a normal European system where the levels of owner occupation are roughly the same if you're age 40 in Germany and in Britain. But the overall is different because the young people are not there. Now the other side of this is about income distribution and intergenerational income distribution. My generation, and indeed the generation below me, are reasonably well off and have been looked after very nicely by the economy and by the state. And therefore they have money to put somewhere. And guess where? Well, you've got negative interest rates. You're lucky if your fixed interest bond which comes up gives you 0.01%. So it's not difficult to say to somebody whose mother's just died and they're able to sell six away and then put money. It's meant to be helping you reach to 100 comfortably. Rental will give you a reasonable stream. So we're buying the net aspect of it, the supply side story, it's a demand side story. But it is not a risk-free story. And I think what Bank of England is worried about is the risk-free story. The Bank of England is also worried about something else, which I find difficult because I'm a housing person. And that is that the Bank of England's role is to stabilise the economy. If the process for housing market is effective, it doesn't care. Only if it builds back into the economy. Its role is to make sure that the economy, financial system is secure, and if it looks as though there is a bit of a scare, because we might, for instance, in terms of a referendum or other things, we might find ourselves having to jump interest rates by 5%. Then they don't want a vast number of people who can't afford to pay for it. So that's the reason why the issue is at that time. But it is the case that we have income distribution in favour of older people, and therefore the system is favouring people having two homes and accommodating somebody for rent rather than looking after your kids or whatever.
I mean, I think on that, I think you're spot on. You know, the numbers are changing. The way they save, or frankly don't save, has completely changed from what it was 20 years ago. It's one of the issues about equity for mortgages. But I think possibly, as an island, we need to look at our buy-to-let sector, particularly our new build sector, which I sense is very much focused on what I would call the affluent professional, and perhaps we haven't given enough thought to providing for rented accommodation of a new build quality for those who are just going into work, because actually that's where a lot of the demand is.
I think we have a lot of discussion about institutional money coming in to do this. I'm sure you have the same. I mean, you're all told there's sheds of money out there and people coming down way. Student accommodation, you don't have higher education so much, and anyway, you don't have to leave home to get it. Student accommodation is a really, really effective part of the market. You get institutional money in it, you get reasonable standards, and you get new build. But we haven't managed to translate that to the young professional market.
Yeah.
And I don't think it inherently needs institutional funding. I think it can be done by mum and dad in some ways.
I think it's a separate market with the economy not needing to grow our young professionals.
The core issue is, one of the core issues is you need two bedrooms which are the same size. You don't need one big bedroom and one small bedroom.
More intelligent architecture. So I'll throw that in. Steve, I sense you've got a question.
Yeah, hello panel. My name is Steve Williams. I work for the Guernsey Housing Association. And just for clarity, we're not state-owned, just for everyone's benefit in the room. We are an independent housing association like they are in the UK. We obviously depend on the states for about 30% of our funding to support new housing, and the other 70% from private finance. But my main point was really, if there's a risk-averse, say, slightly reticent states wanting to get involved here, is the least risk, least financial burden route the mortgage guarantee proposal rather than a help to buy?
It's a lease.
In terms of the states underwriting the gap and the mortgage
I just don't think it's going to be enough. I doubt it's enough to get everything started. And I think I need to know an awful lot more about how your banks are not operating and who is being excluded to know whether it could really make a significant difference.
Tony, isn't it a basket of actions? I think Steve's point's valid in his press article yesterday, the day before. I think Steve said partial ownership isn't the answer. It's part of the answer. But what we need to do is we need to keep revisiting these different facets. Come back to the idea of the covenants and the IDP. Will that absolutely help us to achieve the social housing solution we want? And even if it does, if it absolutely stymies construction altogether, so actually it won't deliver it because actually the building won't happen. So it's this kind of vortex, this potentially negative vortex that I'm just so concerned about. We need lots of different actions.
Well, I think you're right, Paul, on lots of different actions. Slightly comes back to where I started an hour and a half ago, is that everything is interconnected. Nothing happens in isolation in the housing market. And I don't think this room would probably agree that we're looking at everything in the context of how it impacts everything else, how quickly we look at it, and the effects that the various actions will have.
Hi, Martin Belcher, citizen of Guernsey and general businessman, I suppose. I just want to slightly broaden it, probably because it's a little bit of a political statement as well, but to me, the housing market is a facet. One of the major problems with Guernsey, as I see it at the moment, is confidence. And confidence, particularly when you compare it with Jersey, and obviously most people know I spent a lot of time in Jersey, Guernsey desperately needs a huge boost of confidence. And it seems to me that it's very difficult to be confident when there isn't a strong, stable housing market. So my question to the panel, particularly the local ones, is what would they advise the incoming states to do to boost confidence and prices, if you like, in the housing market in the years to come?
I'll give a couple of things. This group, the Chief Minister, the TNI Minister, the CNE Minister, myself and Deputy Salisbury, have been working and interacting, Martin, with, as I said, the major conveyancing advocates and pretty much all of the estate agents and the construction group. So there is a dialogue going on. Locate Guernsey is there to try and actually bring investment in, whether it be high net worths or other investors. So that's one part of it. But Deputy Salisbury's amendment to try and say, let's not constrict ourselves with a housing target that's not based on any fact, but also may not actually be sensible. Let's not absolutely believe that the GHA is the answer to all of our social housing needs, because I'm sure Steve would agree. He would believe that only the GHA should be providing social housing. But I agree with you, Martin, it's about confidence. And the new Assembly, the new 38+2 from Albany, in the new system of government, the Policy and Resources Committee, along with the committees that are going to have these mandates, I just have got to accept that we've got to do some proactive things if we're going to break this cycle. Jersey is it's tried hard, it's trying to invest its way out of its recession. The 44 million economic stimulus back in 2009, I think it was, failed. It failed in the sense that the money was spent on public infrastructure, but it didn't stimulate the economy. They're now committed to, I think it's a 200 million in public infrastructure investment, 300 new social housing homes. So Jersey is actually making some big, bold decisions which they hope will kickstart their economy. Guernsey has to do something similar. We have to be conscious of the social housing needs. We've also, which is the other sort of myth, we all know about the ageing demographic, and we all know about the supporting living, aging, well strategy, which says as our population gets older, we're going to need more nursing homes, care homes, sort of residential care homes. The private sector of Guernsey, we need to be encouraging them to double the size of all their facilities, frankly, because if that doesn't happen, the state is going to have a massive infrastructure investment to provide for our elders as we go forward. All of these are complex, but absolutely could be resolved. We've got capital on the island, we've got great innovation, and we need people to have the confidence to invest.
Yeah, I look at it, and I agree with you, Paul. You and I need somewhere to live in the next 30 years.
You might, I don't know.
No, I do. Absolutely, I do. But I think one of the differences, and I'd be really interested in Martin's take, is that I sense at the moment there is more confidence in Jersey, but I also wonder whether that is linked to the fact that their population is broadly going up by 1,000 a year, whereas, as I identified earlier, we've lost a few hundred over the last couple of years. And so if you take 1,000 people coming in, you divide it by half, so it's 2 people per residence, that's an extra demand for 500 residential units a year. Now that drives an awful lot of things. It drives demand, it drives prices, and it drives construction. So possibly, I'll come back to Martin, do you sense that that's right over there? Knowing how long you spent in Jersey, Martin?
I certainly believe it's part of the equation, and undoubtedly moving forward
forget, let's ask Spencer Neumann how many open market properties there are available, A, for sale at the moment, of the 1,800 that there are, but how many are empty in the sense that they're not being lived in by their owners? How many local market properties are available, not being lived in? How many are available for sale if there was a market as such? And if you remember back to the 2007, when we were at the peak of our economic activity, there were 800 job vacancies in the finance sector and associated sectors. That's fact. That was what the recruitment agencies together said. The crash happened in 2007-8. Those jobs disappeared over that 6 months period to no job vacancies at all. So even if we actually had at the 800 jobs at 2 people coming in, 1,600 people, we don't need to see our population of 62,720 increase by much to really stimulate the market in the way that Martin and Jeremy mentioned earlier. It's not a massive population increase, but absolutely some immigration of economically active people would actually start making these markets work, and then the confidence would come. And then we've got this virtuous cycle that Guernsey enjoyed for 40 years.
We're not used to this. It's not huge numbers, is it? It's not, but at least if they're positive, it has a positive impact, doesn't it?
I would like to add that Guernsey have just quite recently suspended their policy of requiring affordable housing to be a burden on private development because it wasn't working and development wasn't coming forward. So they do have the separate model of Andean delivering their affordable housing. But I don't really follow the logic of why Guernsey is now moving to seeking to impose a policy of planning covenants on private housing when you can see that, another marketplace that is relatively similar to us, Jersey, that simply hasn't worked for them and they've abandoned it in time.
So you're saying sort of slightly swallow our pride and look across the water and try and learn from their experience?
Or if we don't want to learn from their experience, which is fine, we want to gather our own evidence base to be quite certain what the unforeseen consequences may be of imposing this burden on the construction industry, because I don't believe planning covenants in their proposed form are going to deliver what anybody is hoping they will deliver. And it is far more likely that they're going to cause very serious unforeseen consequences and a downturn in the construction market.
And remember, Claire just made that point about Jersey, so fact, not opinion.
Yeah, no, I work in Jersey too, so...
It doesn't make you a bad person. Christine made exactly the same point herself about the UK market in terms of learning from this very similar process. I'm just worried. Good old Guernsey, we've always been 10 years behind, which means that we usually don't make a big mistake of being at the front. But the trouble is, I don't want us to be 10 years behind on this if England has already seen that absolutely didn't quite deliver what it wanted and there were unintended consequences. And did so with what Claire just said in Jersey. This is one cycle. I'd rather we actually don't have a go at the tail end of when everybody else has done it. Why? Let's be clever. I think Martin's alluded to some of the areas we can do something far more positive, relevant, still proportionate and empathetic to our heritage and our own life.
I agree.
Sorry to interrupt you, Paul. I think we're sadly out of time. So,
yeah, we're 5 past. Are we done?
A very big thank you to Martin and our panel today. Thank you, Tony, for a very interesting discussion. And perhaps we can all go away and dwell on what we've heard. Thank you very much.